Welcome to In the Driver's Seat. This is the podcast that drives you through the latest news, trends, and hot topics in the world and how they intersect with fleet and fleet management. I'm your host, Samantha Tarian, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about health, wellness, and physical fitness. So whether you're a driver or maybe you have more of an administrative role requiring you to be seated for most of the day, physical fitness and health play a role in your day-to-day, whether you realize it or not. And I'm super excited because joining me today is Phil Hanson. Phil is an endurance racing driver that has really quickly made his mark in the sport. In 2020, he became the first driver to win the FIA World Endurance Championship, European Le Mans Series, and the Le Mans 24 Hours, all in the same year. So pretty impressive. Phil is the youngest driver ever to win a WEC title and the youngest British driver to win LMP2 at Le Mans. He was the youngest Asian Le Mans Series LMP3 champion, the youngest European Le Mans Series outright race winner. Oh my gosh, these are such a mouthful. And the youngest outright Asian Le Mans Series championship winner. So Phil, wow, welcome to the show. I'm really excited to talk with you and share some of your wisdom and experience with the audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Samantha.
So why don't we just kind of start with a little bit of background? Can you tell us about your journey into motorsports?
Yeah, so like most drivers, I started off in go-karting when I was young. I say young because a lot of guys in racing nowadays start at very young ages, sort of like 6, 8 years old. I started what's considered very late in the sport, which was around 14. Spent a couple of years in go-karting, won the British Championship at that time in my engine class, and then moved into car racing and kind of went up the ladder, but not the single-seater path, more the endurance route. So in prototypes, and now I'm racing hypercar, which is the top category of endurance in Le Mans and in the US as well. So two different championships called the WEC, the World Endurance Championship. And then also out in America, I do some races in IMSA, which is the equivalent, but just out in the US only. So yeah, I race in two different teams. One's called JDC, the other one is called Hertz Team Jota. And yeah, it's been a crazy beginning of my career in the last sort of eight years.
That is so cool. Endurance racing. So for our audience who doesn't know what endurance racing is, it really does require you to drive for long stints of time. What has been like the longest stint of time that you've driven for?
Yeah, so most notably, I mean, on a social level, whenever I tell people, what I do, normally the answer is either they know exactly what it is or F1. It's like, no, not F1. Have you heard of the 24 Hours of Le Mans? And the 50-50, sometimes you have, sometimes they haven't. And the 24 Hours of Le Mans is a 24-hour race. That's our longest race of the year. I share the car with two other drivers. So we change in pit stops and we share the driving throughout the race. We don't do all 8 hours in one go. We'll do anywhere between two, a bit shorter than two, like 1.5 hours, up to 4 hours. 4 hours in a 6-hour period is actually the regulated maximum drive time within a 6-hour period. And sometimes with safety cars and strategies changing and conditions changing, you may have planned to do a triple stint and be out the car just under 3 hours. But then with safety cars, you could be in the car close to that 4-hour mark, which can be, quite fatiguing. Luckily, as a racing driver in these cars and cars being designed to do these races for such long durations, the car, the seat itself is molded to us. We have all these provisions in place to make it easier. But obviously, there's no luxury in these race cars. Fundamentally, it's all about making it as fast as possible. So weight is a crucial element. So there's none of the sort of things you'd normally see in a traditional road car in that race car.
Yeah, I'm thinking, so it is fall here in New Hampshire, and so we have beautiful foliage, and I'm just thinking about my husband, my dog, and I are driving up north. It's about like a 2-hour drive, and I start to get really uncomfortable, but I also have like heated seats. I have like this cushy cushion. How do you physically prepare for something like that? Like, what does your workout routine look like? Are you stretching? Like, what are some of the important things that physically you have to do to be able to do that comfortably?
Yeah, it's a good question because again, like depending on how well versatile motorsport. People often sometimes don't realize that the physical toll, cardiovascular toll on a driver. So at different races with different ambient temperatures and cockpit temperatures, there can be different strain on the body. So some races I might find very easy. I could be sat in like a zone 2 heart rate the whole time, which should be anywhere between, like, for me, around 130 to 140. For other events where it's much hotter and the cockpit temperature can reach 50 degrees Celsius with a full suit, racing underwear, Nomex, balaclava, gloves, it's like lying on a beach with a helmet on and all that kit. You would get very hot very quickly. There's a bit of airflow, which means it's never quite as unbearable as I'm describing. But in those races at physical tracks, my heart rate could be high 3, low zone 4, which is, basically like going for a pretty intense run for that entire duration. But then it's not just a run where you can kind of turn your brain off and kind of let your mind wander. You're having to concentrate. So any drop in fitness can impact your fatigue mentally as well. So that's very important to try and train for. And how I do that is a lot of cardiovascular stuff. So interval training, a lot of cycling, a lot of low impact cardio. So using a lot of the erg machines like ski ergs, row ergs, bike ergs, CrossFit style workouts, especially the cardiovascular side. And then some functional S&C, strength and conditioning stuff, just for foundational strength. And over the years, I've been very good with my mobility. I think it's probably not as great as it has been in the past now, just because I'm complacent and not putting as much attention on it as I probably should. But generally, I think I move quite well as an athlete, better than some of my teammates. So I feel like I'm okay. That's probably where the complacency started. I'm like, well, they're not doing a lot of mobility, so maybe I shouldn't have to. But yeah, that's important, obviously, to prevent injury and things like this. And ultimately, a lot of what you have in the car and what you need to be able to perform in the car is difficult to replicate in the gym. But I try and break it down and just look at the foundational stuff that makes me a better athlete and can improve the sort of lessening of that fatigue when it does set in, if it does set in. And I always think of myself as training for those 1 in 100 occasions where all the ambient temperature, the track's super physical, you're in the middle of a really intense race where that could really be stacked against you. So I'd rather be incredibly fit for that and then comfortably fit for the other races, rather than be kind of in the middle of it and then struggling when I do hit that one tough scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned the mobility. I feel like mobility is the thing that we all kind of let go to the wayside. I have a certification in personal training and fitness nutrition, so this is something I love talking about. And yeah, I'm definitely one of those people that lets my mobility training kind of fall off, and then my hips start to feel it. um,
It's funny because there's so much of the body that you have to be like fluid in different ranges of motion. So whenever I do mobility, it's always I'm addressing what's tight or what's sore from a previous workout. So I never spend enough time doing things I should just be doing maintenance on. So the way I always thought about it is when I do mobility, it's not what I want to work and move through, it's what I want to avoid because I don't spend enough time doing every part of the body.
that is absolutely true. I'm curious. This is just for my own curiosity. Do you ever do you do like neck strengthening
Yeah.
exercises? I feel like maybe I have seen that because I can imagine, you guys are kind of just like seated there the whole time. Like, what do you do for your like mobility in your neck region?
Yeah, so I do some neck training. Not as much as you would see an F1 driver do because they carry higher G forces. We have it less G forces, but for a long period of time. So you have to have that endurance element at play. I have done some, especially in last winter when I had a longer break off racing. I think that's where it's tricky when your sort of body gets used to without that stimulant on that neck muscle. So you've got tools available. There's certain like harnesses and stuff you can wear to help isolate certain muscles that you try and train for. I think I've got a very good foundation from some of the stuff I did when I was younger in strength training. I had a really good PT that was very particular about certain movements, and I think that built a really good foundation of like my trap and areas of that bigger neck muscles that work really well in unison. So whilst it's great to isolate some of the sort of flexing muscles when you go like this, which there's not actually one, it kind of comes around the front, your struggle with a name, whatever it may be. So sometimes it's not easy to isolate those muscles, but having a good foundation from your biggest neck muscle, your trap, was key. So I've never really struggled with my neck too much, but it is something that I'm aware of, and especially in the off season, for example, in the winter now, a few months out of the car, I think you can lose that strength quite quickly. It's not a neck, it's not a muscle that get trained or that you can train in the gym every now and then, or you're not going to come across movements that are going to isolate it. So yeah, having some intent there, I think is going to be important in these months.
I'm gonna have to get that PT because I find myself when I'm driving, I'm like this, like, oh my gosh, my neck. But so to kind of bring it back to our topic and to relate this to our audience, I was, doing some research, and I'm somebody that, I'm sitting at a desk 8 hours a day. Of course, I love my fitness. I'm at the gym in the morning, but for most of my day, I'm kind of seated. And in recent years, studies have really compared the dangers of sitting and the growing epidemic of just an overall sedentary lifestyle, especially in America, to smoking tobacco. They say over 25% of American adults are sitting for more than 8 hours every day, and almost half of those people get little to no exercise. So I'm really thinking about the people in the fleet industry, like I said in the intro, whether they're driving for long periods of time or even sitting at their desk like I am for a typical 9 to 5. Obviously, what you do as a racer is very different, but certainly there are a lot of similarities as it relates to strain on the body over time. And I'm curious if you have any recommendations that, if there are specific areas that you could recommend focusing on for people who are sitting for a long period of time to alleviate some of those strains that maybe you notice yourself feeling sitting in the car for a long period of time that can translate to somebody just sitting in general.
Yeah. So like I said, I think the important differences to make clear before I start helping people with advice for driving is the fact that we're actually like reclined. So we're laying back. So our legs and knees are actually above our lowest point of our body, which are like our bum, our backside. So we're kind of in that reclined position for center of gravity for the performance aspect. But actually our seat is designed to support us through the G-force and give us support where we need it in the racing. So you've got a lot of ability to add pressure in certain areas where you think you need it. So some drivers, similar height and similar weight to me, might have different seating positions based on their general posture, whether they require more lumbar, which after a while can be the biggest issue. So most drivers, I think, if you talk to a physio or a sports masseuse that works with racing drivers, you'll find that the areas that get tight, especially in endurance, are sort of your medial glute up into your QLs or your lower back, all that region. And that comes from basically coming loose a little bit in the seat, and then all that force going through the pedals constantly. And whilst all the G's moving your knees, you end up lifting your ass a little bit out the seat, and then it goes basically straight into your lower back. So after a while, if you don't have enough lumbar support, that can be an issue. So I'd say that a lot of modern cars now, they have that lumbar support option in the seat, but a lot of people don't really play around with it. They more care about the distance to the pedals and how they're cramping up the upper body. But I'd say that's one thing that people probably overlook. And I think that's quite key that I've realized when I use a car daily, to have like decent lumbar support can really take pressure off your lower back. Especially a lot of people sat down all day long can find lower back issues because their glutes get tight and all these things similar to racing. And then the other really big thing that's obviously we're really on top of in the sport, and I've got really good people at Jota, like a guy called Pete Webster is really great with all this sort of stuff, is hydration. I think if you're dehydrated, you're more likely to not only fatigue, but also get cramps in all these areas. So having adequate hydration when you're driving, I know a lot of people don't like to drink too much water because they're constantly stopping, but getting a water with some electrolyte tablets or some electrolyte powder, so you don't have to necessarily consume so much liquid and fluid, but you're getting enough potassium, magnesium, and sodium, so that you're actually not getting dehydrated. And obviously in the race car, making sure we're hydrated prior to the stint. During the stint, drinking when you're driving, you have a drinks bottle in the car. You can connect on the drinks hose. I've never been a massive fan of that, but I've been forced to use it at times this year for the first time in my career, I must say. But then also in the pit stop, if you're doing a double stint, they'll come to you with your drinks bottle, which I always ask to have incredibly strong, because I don't want to be drinking a huge amount of fluid because you've only got 20 seconds to drink it. But I really want a really strong electrolyte formula in there. So it's also good because it gives me a little bit of a taste. They're quite tasty stuff. I think
Yeah,
hydration is
absolutely.
often really overlooked generally in sports. So, and even when you're doing your day-to-day stuff and working, not getting adequate salts and stuff can really make a difference. And I think I've had a positive impact on my friends on this topic, and a lot of them have seen that their day-to-day stuff gets easier when they're taking the hydration seriously.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, but I wasn't necessarily expecting you to talk about hydration. I was expecting you to talk more about stretching and kind of that typical stuff. But yeah, hydration is super important. And I also feel like, and maybe this is kind of just the side of social media that I'm on because I am very passionate about health and wellness, but um, people are starting to realize the importance of those electrolytes and not just plain drinking water. So that I see a lot of people doing like the gallon challenge, drinking a gallon of water a day and having some kind of adverse side effects from that and not realizing that they really need to replenish with those electrolytes because that plain water could just be flushing those electrolytes out of their system. So super interesting. I love that you brought that up. And one thing that I don't think uh, people in the fleet industry, drivers, honestly, people that just work a desk job, it's very easy to see our job as what we're physically doing on the computer, driving, etc. Um, but we don't necessarily take into consideration the safety aspect of it and how if our body is not performing optimally, we may not be able to do our job. And so I think there's a whole safety aspect that comes into play when we're talking about health and physical fitness as well. Do you notice that kind of connection in your world as well, where like keeping your body in good condition leads to safer outcomes?
I think so. I think when you look at our sport from the outside, it's there's a skill element and a physical element. I think the sort of limiting factor is normally the skill element, but if you don't have adequate fitness, you can't apply any of that skill. I've always been on the mindset and argued many times with people that come across it with a different argument is that the fitter you are, the better you can apply the skill in all ranges of what you do. So, like I said, when I'm training for that one really tough race, when those conditions arrive and people are stressed, people are heading into the weekend thinking, yeah, it's going to be a really tough one. I think, well, in my mind already, I think I have an edge on you, which in itself is an edge because of the placebo of thinking that, I'm going in more confident. Seeing that you're flustered about that, my competition gives me a bit more of an edge as well. So it all feeds into that same thing. So yeah, when you look at the sport in general, you have that mixture between the skill and the physical. But I think there's no such thing as being too fit unless it starts to really somehow impact your fast twitch fibers or something like this, which I've heard from some people. But I think that level of being too fit is so far from within my reach, at least. When I think it's also there's some great influence out there nowadays, which is showing, the reality of what overtraining is and how far you can actually push the human body, which I find really quite interesting. And I'm actually a bit behind that message that overtraining is actually a lot further than what we perceive it to be. It's only until you have, month on month issues or long lasting effects, which isn't normally what happens when someone's just tired and they say, well, I've overtrained. It's like, well, I think overtraining is probably the wrong terminology. But yeah,
Yeah.
the difference between the skill and the physical is always disputed. But like I said, the better you can prepare yourself for that, the better it is the better you can implement your skill, which ultimately can prevent accidents. So in terms of safety, like you asked, preventing a crash, preventing a mistake, preventing all that sort of stuff across the season will help you, me achieve a higher position in the championship. Obviously, if you crash, you're going to DNF and it's going to be a big toll on the team. I never think of it as like a personal safety thing because I believe my sport to be incredibly safe these days, even though from the outside maybe it looks like a dangerous sport. I think they've made such good strides in safety that I've never ever felt unsafe. But obviously there's certain conditions where where, it becomes more unsafe, let's say.
And to touch on that overtraining topic that you brought up, if you haven't read it yet, highly recommend David Goggins' book,
Yeah.
Can't Hurt Me. Oh my gosh. Yeah. You reading that book, you realize what the human body is capable of. And it's a lot more than I think we realize. Um, but beyond the physical fitness, and you kind of talked about this too, what role does like mental endurance play during these long races? And do you have any strategies for maintaining focus and clarity that, you know, maybe could be used for fleet drivers who need to stay alert for extended hours?
Yeah. So this is a difficult question for you to answer because I've been doing this sport and endurance for so many years. I kind of forget what I really used in those early years. Now, on my experience of it is kind of what I lean towards. I'm able to stay focused, not suffer. Also, with thanks to the sort of emphasis I put on hydration and my physical fitness, because, like I said, when that starts to deteriorate, it really starts to affect your fatigue mentally. But staying focused during the long races is difficult. It's definitely more difficult in the early days of my career. I think now I don't struggle with it at all. But that comes with experience. So I'd say the crossover there is the more you do something, the more experienced you become with it. You start to find it all easier, start to stay focused consistently much easier. Um, Same with the David Goggins thing you mentioned, like with the overtraining. What's nice about that book, as well as he talks about where he came from, which was, an overweight guy who had absolutely no physical ability whatsoever, couldn't run a block. But he talks a little bit about the journey that he went on to become, someone that ran eight 100-mile ultra marathons 8 weekends in a row, I think it was, which is like obscene with injuries that he sustained. And, so I think it shows you that like continuous progress makes a big difference. And I think that's also what's I can bridge to my endurance racing and the fact that I'm not able to be distracted as easy because that experience is growing every year on year on year on year. So I think when you're starting something, yeah, you have all these issues, but as long as you stick with it, you start to build that experience and learn what works for you and how to stay focused and all these things. So people on long journeys, it can be very daunting doing your longest journey. So you have an 8, 10, 12-hour drive. Once you've done it, though, it's amazing how that becomes almost a norm. Well, it's not as bad because I've done the 8 hours previously. I did that 12-hour journey last year. So you start to feel confident in it and the experience builds, you know what worked for you and what didn't for you. So as long as you're doing a little bit to prepare in terms of like hydration and all these things and making sure you're not, sitting in an uncomfortable position for a long period of time and getting sleepy and putting potentially yourself and others at risk on long journeys, then I think the next part is just building that experience and feeling comfortable. Obviously, when I drive on a daily basis, whether it's to the supermarket or to see my friends or back and forth from the airport, music, all that sort of stuff, or these things we don't have in the race car really help. And it's also nice, you can pick up the water bottle, you can pick up the phone and call someone, obviously with hands-free and stuff like this. You can't exactly do that to stay focused, but in the race car, you've got the adrenaline of the fact that you're performing at a high heart rate. There's added stress. You're constantly doing things. You're talking on the radio. You're computing so many different decisions really quickly when you're passing traffic that it's easy to stay focused compared to being sat on the motorway staring at those sort of very dull, consistent white lines that are almost like sleep inducing. So yeah, sometimes I actually struggle when doing long journeys on the road because there's so little focus required for me that I need someone to be on the phone with me, otherwise I just get very sleepy.
Fair. That is fair. Okay, some fun questions. What, I guess, what are you driving right now on day to day to the grocery store? Like, what is an endurance racer driving in real life?
A lot of people
And
drive
what's your
different
dream
things.
car?
I get criticized by my teammate in America because he says it's like so boring, like I'm not a 50-year-old man, but I drive a Range Rover. I've had it now for like 5 years. And it's all right, but I've noticed recently that a lot of electronic gremlins have come up because I've been away for so long. So I think it needs to go for service next week and get rid of all this stuff is really irritating me. For example, like I put the window down the other day and I went to put it up and it would just go up in increments. It was driving me insane. Like something is not, I'm not putting my window up and down every day, but Yeah, that's going to get to me, especially if I have to keep pressing the button as it goes up in little increments. I don't know where that comes from. But yeah, that's why I drive as my daily driver. I know other drivers have much more exciting stuff. Some guys have more boring stuff, but yeah. For me, because I live in London and on the outside of London as well, it's just good for traffic to be a bit higher up because it makes you feel less claustrophobic when you're sort of sat down around all these big cars.
Nice. Range Rovers are still very nice. I
Oh yeah,
actually
don't
just
get me
got my
wrong.
first SUV. I just got my first SUV, and I can agree with you. I like being sat up a little bit higher. I can see what's going on. Um, and second fun question, what are you listening to on the radio to keep you up, to keep you focused?
Well, recently I've been listening to like, oh, it sounds so boring. It ties into everything he says about me, my teammate. I listen
Oh
to
no.
a radio station called LBC where they like people calling in and talking about like issues and stuff. Just because it's like a good time when I'm driving just to have a little bit of education with world issues and stuff like that. But I wouldn't say that's the majority of the time. I'd say that's like 30% of the time. The rest of the time, I've got my own Spotify playlist where I flick between, I don't know, house, deep house, like all that sort of stuff. Sometimes oldies, 60s, 70s, 80s stuff. Depends on the mood. I'm not going to say I listen to one thing. I think more often than not, it's sort of house or techno or something like that. But yeah.
Cool. And last question, what's next for you and how can our listeners follow along on your career?
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, tomorrow I travel out to Atlanta for the final round of IMSA. It's called Petit Le Mans is the event. And then in a few weeks' time, I'm in Bahrain for the final round of the World Endurance Championship. Like I said, I race with two different teams this year. So, yeah, they can follow me along on Instagram, on social media, Phil Hanson Racing. And yeah, that's next for me, those races. Trying to end the year on a high. It's always nice to go out on a high. But everyone's thinking the same. So, yeah, it's going to be a tough one.
Awesome. Well, best of luck to you. And thank you so much for your time today, Phil. This is really important stuff that I think is going to really benefit a lot of people. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. You can stay up to date on these conversations and more by visiting us at merchantsfleet.com and following us on LinkedIn. I look forward to getting into the driver's seat alongside you next time.